Welcome back to the Judgment Files. We often dive into these really dense, complex legal battles.
Oh, yeah.
But today's topic is something that might seem pretty straightforward at first glance. We're talking about prayer.
Prayer.
Specifically, the role of prayer in public schools.
Oh, now that's a topic that sparked some, let's just say, lively debate over the years.
You got that right. And you, our amazing listeners, sent in some fascinating material for us to explore.
Excellent.
It all centers around a landmark Supreme Court case.
Okay.
Engel v. Vitale.
Engel v. Vitale from 1962.
That's the one. Now, our mission today is to really get to the heart of this ruling. Why did it happen? And what does it mean for the separation of church and state, especially when it comes to education?
Big questions.
We're going to unpack all the juicy details of the case, the historical context, and the different perspectives that clashed on this issue.
All with the goal of giving you a clear understanding of this really pivotal moment in American legal history. Love it. So, what kind of materials are we working with today?
Well, we've got the Supreme Court syllabus, of course.
Of course.
And Justice Black's majority opinion.
The big one.
But we're also diving into Justice Douglas's concurring opinion.
Interesting.
And even Justice Stewart's dissenting opinion.
So we're getting a full spectrum of views on this.
Oh, absolutely. These documents give us the facts of the case, the legal reasoning, and...
Oh, the contrasting viewpoints. That's where things get really interesting, right? Seeing how brilliant legal minds grapple with such a fundamental issue, something that's at the core of individual liberty and the government's role.
It's like watching a high-stakes chess match. Okay, let's set the scene.
All right.
Take us back to the beginning.
To the genesis of the case.
What was the specific prayer that ignited this whole legal firestorm?
So, the prayer itself was actually pretty short and simple.
Okay.
It went like this. Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country.
It does sound pretty general, pretty harmless almost.
Right. You hear it and you think, well, who could object to that?
Exactly. So how did this seemingly innocuous prayer end up in front of the highest court in the land?
Well, there's a bit more to the story.
I bet there is.
This prayer wasn't just something that spontaneously popped up in a classroom. It was actually recommended
By
the New York State Board of Regents.
So this is coming from a pretty high level.
Oh, yeah. This is a governmental agency with a ton of authority over public schools in the state.
I see.
They released this statement on moral and spiritual training in the schools, and they saw this prayer as something that all men and women of goodwill could get behind.
Interesting. So the state government itself was actively involved in crafting and promoting this prayer.
That's the key point. It wasn't just a local school board making a decision. This was coming from the state level.
Right. And that's going to be important later on, I'm sure. But before we get into the legal arguments, let's talk about who challenged this prayer and why.
Okay.
Who were the plaintiffs in this case?
So the lawsuit was brought by parents.
Parents of students.
Yeah, parents of 10 students in the school district.
Okay. And what were their objections?
Well, the primary argument was that this daily prayer violated their religious beliefs and practices.
They didn't feel that this prayer represented their faith.
Exactly. And they also argued that it wasn't just about the specific wording of the prayer itself, it was about the state's involvement.
Oh, okay. So they weren't just challenging the prayer itself, but the legality, the constitutionality of the whole thing.
Exactly. They challenged the state law that permitted prayer in school and the school district's rule requiring this specific prayer.
And what was their legal basis for doing so?
They claimed this was a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment.
The Establishment Clause. Now, just as a quick reminder for our listeners, that's the part of the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Right. And it applies to the states, too, thanks to the 14th Amendment.
Precisely. So the parents were arguing that the state, by endorsing and promoting this prayer, was essentially establishing a religion, which is a no-no according to the First Amendment.
Bingo. Now, what's interesting is that the New York Court of Appeals initially upheld the prayer.
Oh, really?
But there was a catch.
Okay, what was the catch?
They ruled that the prayer was fine, but only as long as students could choose not to participate if they or their parents objected.
So there was an opt-out option.
Exactly. The court thought that voluntary participation was a way to sort of sidestep the Establishment Clause issue.
Interesting strategy. But as we know, the Supreme Court had a different take on this whole thing.
Oh, yeah. Things were about to get supreme.
Yeah. All right, let's dive into the Supreme Court's decision,
Let's do it.
starting with Justice Black's majority opinion. What was the court's main argument?
So, Justice Black, writing for the majority, was very clear. New York's prayer program was a religious activity. He called it a solemn avowal of divine faith and supplication.
Wow, powerful language.
And the core argument was that the government simply shouldn't be in the business of composing official prayers for anyone to recite, especially as part of a government-sponsored program.
So it wasn't just about the prayer itself, but about who was behind it.
Exactly. The court drew a line in the sand. Government and religion, separate spheres.
And they grounded this argument in the First Amendment's prohibition against the establishment of religion.
Absolutely. And to really drive home the point, Justice Black delved into historical context.
Ooh, I love it when they do that. History lessons from the Supreme Court. What did he talk about?
He brought up the history of government-composed prayers in England, specifically mentioning the Book of Common Prayer. You know, the one that was used for centuries in the Church of England.
Yeah, the one that caused all kinds of conflict and upheaval as the officially sanctioned version changed based on who was in power at the time.
Right. And that history of religious strife and turmoil, that's exactly what the court was worried about. They saw a direct connection between state-sponsored prayer and religious conflict.
I see. So even a seemingly harmless, non-denominational prayer could set a dangerous precedent.
That's the concern.
It's easy to forget that the push for religious freedom in America wasn't just about the freedom to practice one's own faith.
Right.
It was also about the freedom from government-imposed religion.
Exactly. Justice Black even pointed out a bit of irony.
Okay.
Some of the early colonies, the ones that had fled religious persecution, they ended up establishing their own official religions.
Oh, wow, that's kind of hypocritical, isn't it?
Well, it shows how deeply ingrained the idea of a state-sponsored religion was at the time.
But by the time the Constitution was being drafted, those historical experiences of religious conflict had really shifted the thinking, right?
Absolutely. By then, there was a widespread understanding of the dangers of mixing church and state, and that understanding was hard-won. It was based on centuries of conflict and struggle.
So the First Amendment was meant as a safeguard, a strong protection against the government meddling in religious affairs.
Right. The court saw the First Amendment as a guarantee that the government wouldn't try to control, influence, or support prayer in any way.
Because that way, religious matters wouldn't be subject to political pressure or manipulation.
Precisely. And in the court's view, New York's prayer program crossed that line. They concluded that it was, in effect, establishing religious beliefs.
Even though it was non-denominational.
Even though it was non-denominational, and even though students could opt out.
Right, because the state was still the one endorsing and promoting the prayer.
Exactly. Justice Black addressed that argument head-on. He said that the non-denominational nature of the prayer and the opt-out provision didn't change the fact that the state was violating the Establishment Clause.
And the court emphasized that the Establishment Clause doesn't require forced participation to be violated.
Right. The government simply endorsing or sponsoring religious activity is enough to trigger a violation.
Okay, so it's not just about individual coercion. It's about preventing the government from taking a position on religion, period.
Exactly. It's about that principle of neutrality.
So what did Justice Black say were the main purposes behind the Establishment Clause? Why is this separation so important?
Well, he argued it was to prevent the government from undermining its own stability and from degrading religion itself.
Okay, interesting.
And it's also about avoiding the conflict and tension that can arise between people of different beliefs, or no beliefs at all.
Right, that makes sense.
And finally, it's about preventing the government from propping up religion in a way that could actually weaken its genuine respect and influence in society.
Yeah. If religion becomes too reliant on state support, it could lose its authenticity and independence.
That's the concern. And to illustrate this point, Justice Black drew a parallel to a very dark chapter in history, the Act of Uniformity in England.
Ah, yes, the one that forced everyone to attend services of the Church of England and punished anyone who dissented.
Right. A pretty stark reminder of what can happen when government and religion become too entangled.
It's almost chilling, considering that many of the colonists who came to America were fleeing that kind of religious persecution.
Right. And that's why Justice Black took pains to clarify something.
What's that?
He wanted to make it clear that prohibiting state-sponsored prayer doesn't mean the court is hostile towards religion or prayer itself.
That's a really important distinction.
Absolutely. He acknowledged the deep connection between humanity and religion and the importance of prayer for countless individuals.
Right. Prayer is a profoundly personal and meaningful practice for many.
Exactly. And he emphasized that the founding fathers wanted to protect individuals' right to pray as they choose, free from any kind of government interference.
Because true religious freedom means the government stays out of the business of dictating or endorsing anyone's beliefs.
That's the core principle.
Now, Justice Douglas, in his concurring opinion, agreed with the majority's conclusion, but focused on a slightly different aspect of the case.
Yeah, his focus was interesting. He zeroed in on the question of government funding. He basically said, can the government constitutionally pay for a religious exercise?
Interesting. He framed it in terms of financial support.
Right. He agreed that the case wasn't about punishing students who chose not to say the prayer, but he was really concerned about the implications of the government putting its financial weight behind religious activity.
I see. So for him, it wasn't just about coercion, but about the potential for government endorsement and the way that financial support can subtly favor certain beliefs over others.
Exactly. And he even brought up examples like the Pledge of Allegiance with its under God phrase and the long-standing practice of opening Supreme Court sessions with the crier's prayer.
Ah, so he was pointing to other instances where the government seems to endorse religion.
Right. And he pointed out that in those cases, you have public officials, people who are literally paid by the government, leading these prayers in government buildings.
So even though participation might technically be voluntary, the context itself creates a kind of pressure or expectation.
He called it a captive audience situation. You're in a government setting, and the government is endorsing a specific religious practice.
That's a really interesting point. It's not about being forced to pray, but about the subtle ways in which the government can create an environment that favors certain beliefs.
Exactly. And while Justice Douglas acknowledged that the regent's prayer might not have been establishing a religion in the strictest historical sense, he argued that government funding of religious exercises introduces a really divisive element into society.
Right, because it implies that the government favors those beliefs over others.
And he also pointed out that even this prayer, which was meant to be generic and inclusive, didn't actually align with the beliefs of all the parties involved in the case.
There was at least one petitioner who was agnostic, right?
Exactly. So even a prayer that tries to be all-encompassing can still end up alienating those who don't subscribe to its basic premise.
Okay, so for Justice Douglas, the concern wasn't just about the specific words of the prayer, but about the government's financial support and what that signifies.
Right. He saw government funding as carrying a real risk of creating division and entanglement in religious matters, potentially opening the door to further government involvement and even conflict between different religious groups.
He even brought up the case of Everson v. Board of Education, which dealt with public funding for transportation to religious schools.
Yeah, he was worried about the precedent that case set and where it could lead.
Okay, now let's turn to the lone dissenter in this case, Justice Stewart. What were his main objections to the majority's ruling?
Justice Stewart felt very strongly that allowing a brief, non-denominational prayer like this didn't amount to establishing an official religion.
So he disagreed with the whole premise of the majority's argument.
Right. His view was that denying students the chance to participate in this prayer was actually depriving them of a part of the nation's spiritual heritage.
Interesting. He flipped the script.
Yeah, he essentially said that preventing this prayer was actually doing a disservice to the students.
And what about the historical arguments that the majority relied on? The stuff about the Book of Common Prayer and the struggles over religious freedom in early America.
Justice Stewart dismissed all that. He argued that those historical examples weren't relevant because this case was specifically about a voluntary prayer, not about creating a state church.
So for him, the voluntary nature of the prayer was key.
Absolutely. And he even took issue with the famous wall of separation metaphor.
Oh, the one that Thomas Jefferson used to describe the relationship between church and state.
That's the one. Justice Stewart pointed out that the phrase wall of separation doesn't actually appear in the Constitution.
Huh. I never thought about that. It's become such a common way to talk about this issue.
Right, but he was arguing that we shouldn't read too much into metaphors. He felt the focus should be on the actual text of the Constitution and the history of how the government has dealt with religion.
Okay, so what did he point to instead?
Well, he emphasized the long history of religious traditions being reflected in government practices. Things like opening sessions of the Supreme Court and Congress with prayer, and presidents invoking God's help and guidance in their speeches.
And he had a whole list of examples, right?
Oh, yeah, going all the way back to George Washington. He even mentioned the Star-Spangled Banner with its "In God is our trust" line, the "Under God" phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, the National Day of Prayer, and even the motto "In God we trust" that we print on our money.
Wow, that's a pretty comprehensive list. He was trying to show that religion has always been a part of American public life.
Exactly. His point was that these traditions, including the Regent's Prayer, didn't establish an official religion, but simply acknowledged the deeply rooted spiritual heritage of the nation. He even traced it back to the Declaration of Independence and its mention of divine providence.
So he was drawing a distinction between a coercive, state-sponsored religion, which the First Amendment clearly forbids, and what he saw as a permissible accommodation of religious sentiment that's in line with this long history of religious expression in America.
Exactly. It's a subtle but important distinction. He saw this prayer as falling on the acceptable side of that line.
Okay, so as you can see, this deep dive into Engel v. Vitale has revealed this fundamental tension in American society. How do we balance religious freedom for all citizens with the principle of separation between church and state, especially in the sensitive context of public education?
It's a tough question, and this case really highlights the anxieties surrounding government involvement in religion and the different ways people interpret the First Amendment's Establishment Clause.
And while the ruling in Engel v. Vitale prohibits officially composed and required prayer in public schools, the debate about religion in public life definitely hasn't gone away.
Oh, not at all. And here's a thought-provoking question to leave you with. Justice Stewart, in his dissent, pointed to all those examples of the government acknowledging religion in various ways. How do you personally reconcile those practices with the majority's concern about establishing a religion through even a seemingly small act like a voluntary prayer in schools?
It's a question worth pondering.
It really is. What does this case tell you about the evolving understanding of religious freedom in America? It's just one piece of a much larger and ongoing conversation about these crucial principles. We encourage you to dig deeper, explore those dissenting opinions, and really wrestle with these ideas.
It's a conversation that we as a society need to keep having. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the intricacies of Engel v. Vitale. We'll see you next time on The Judgment Files.